You're listening to Sparking Conversations on Culturally Responsive Childcare, the podcast where we get real about what culturally responsive practice actually looks like in the day-to-day of early learning. Hi, my name is Sarah Andrews. I'm a public health researcher with a background in child and youth programming.
And I'm Thea Louis. I'm a mom of two boys and an anthropologist. I grew up in Germany and now call Edmonton home.
We're part of the team that was behind the Spark Guide, a guide to culturally responsive early learning and childcare in Alberta, created by PolicyWise for Children and Families, together with early childhood practitioners and experts from across Alberta. We're recording from Treaty 6 territory and the North Saskatchewan River territory of the Métis Nation, a traditional traveling route and gathering place for many Indigenous people. Each episode, we sit down with educators and leaders who share their stories, their light bulb moments, and the small things that make a big difference for belonging and cultural learning. So whether you're brand new to the Spark Guide or looking for fresh inspiration, we're here to spark ideas you can bring into your program tomorrow.
And then if we're asking for what sometimes feels like a whole host of extra work that requires extra time and space and materials, where we're already seeing an undervalued, underpaid, underrecognized workforce, then how do we help educators see that it's not about doing something extra, but it's actually about celebrating?
For this episode, we will dive into the topic of navigating cultural difference across the families in our childcare programs and talk about how we can bridge the tension between integrating diversity and celebrating uniqueness in the day-to-day of early learning. Navigating cultural differences can show up every day, whether we make eye contact to show respect or not, when deciding which celebrations to have with the kids, when building routines around eating and napping, and when communicating with families about goals and priorities. Sometimes, some of these practices or celebrations are an important part of one family's lives, but run counter to the values and traditions of others. How do we bridge that? How do we integrate what we learn from our educator team and our families to navigate difference while still celebrating uniqueness and demonstrating compassion and kindness?
We're thrilled to have Rebecca Leong here to join us today to reflect on her experience and her stories from a long career in early learning and childcare. Rebecca has been working in the field of early learning and childcare for over 20 years with direct experience in family childcare, school-aged care, and center-based childcare. Her focus during her education in both her undergrad and graduate work has been on advocating for the workforce in terms of early learning educator well-being, as well as for children's rights. She is a member of the Alberta Early Learning and Childcare Leaders Caucus under the Canadian Childcare Federation, and is also a casual instructor at Bow Valley College for early childhood education and development. Rebecca is a proud Calgarian, enjoys dancing and playing a variety of sports. She spends as much time with her husband, two cats, friends, and family as she can.
So welcome, Rebecca, and thank you so much for joining us today. Our team met you quite a while ago, early on in the project as a member of our advisory team, and then later on also as a champion for mentorship for culturally responsive childcare. So you bring so much experience in this field, and we're really thrilled to have you here talking about your experience and your stories.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and to share a little bit more about my experience, as well as I just wanted to mention that I am coming to you from the Territory 7. It is also known as Mohkinstsis. I am also on the Métis Otipemisiwak Nation of Alberta, Battle River Territory, Districts 5 and 6, and also any Inuit or other First Nations or Métis people that call this place home.
Thank you. So to start with, we have a question that we ask each one of our guests, and it's really interesting how everyone responds. Can you think of 2 or 3 words that are top of mind when you think of culturally responsive childcare?
I think it's really important to think about it from the perspective of being open-minded and kindness. But I think the top word for me is curiosity. So never assuming that, but also being kind to yourself and understanding that it takes time to learn about other cultures outside of your own. So while it's really important that your experiences come forward in the reasons why you choose to do certain things or be a certain way, it's also important that we are curious about why other people are the way that they are and what drives them and what's important to them, values and ethics wise.
This is really interesting. We've heard curiosity a lot throughout our episodes, but you bring up that kindness to self. So I'm curious to dive into that deeper in a little bit, because for educators who are listening, their own mental health and your own well-being is so important for how we are able to show up for others in our work. But first, let's start a little bit about your journey and how you came to be passionate about culturally responsive childcare.
I think the first thing is that I am a mixed cultural person. So my dad is Chinese and my mom is Canadian, white presenting, and with Scottish roots. And growing up, there weren't as many mixed families as there are now. And at the time, and being raised in Calgary, it was not that different cultures weren't accepted, it was just that it didn't really get talked about. So when we were little, there was nobody really saying, oh, you can't be a Disney princess because they're all white and you don't look like that. Or the conversations around racial slurs or all of that, we just wasn't aware of them. But I also acknowledged that I didn't really have Chinese friends growing up. It wasn't something that was a big deal or not a big deal. It just is something that I've reflected on later in life to think about how did that change my experience of who I was and who I identified as. It also made me want to dive more into family history in terms of that Chinese side and what is important and why my family did certain things a certain way. So I think that was maybe the first curiosity piece of digging through that. And what was really interesting was just only recently I went through the Rupert's Land Elect training for Métis education in early learning and childcare and the year-long program. But talking with all of those people that were exploring their own Métis culture and coming into their own traditions and understanding about where their culture came from and maybe reclaiming culture and watching that process. And even though it isn't the same in my experience, it still brought up a lot of questions just about being mixed. So then what does that mean? And it really made me dig into how does that look when we're in a childcare environment for children that come from two different cultures? And almost every person does come from more than one culture. It's just not obvious all the time. And it doesn't always mean two languages, which is another piece. And I didn't learn Chinese growing up or Cantonese, which was my family's dialect, except for to ask for my lucky money and say Happy New Year. So it was very touristy, the idea of language in my own family even, which has also brought up a lot of questions for me. So it's really interesting digging into this to think about everyone's experience. And that's what I find most interesting.
It is fascinating to hear about your experience with questioning this and reflecting on your journey over the years and where you've come to now. So as a leader in early learning and childcare, what do you observe about that in your day-to-day work and in your work with educators?
In early learning and childcare, we're typically in a group setting, which means there's a whole host of different experiences that are coming through. And most interesting to me in my role as a leader in the field is working with educators who have these different experiences. And the work of childcare is so tied to values, and it changes based on what were the experiences that you had as a child, what is the impact of the society or the culture around you now, and then what are your goals for working with children, and or even have you had the chance to explore your own values and beliefs and that process. So that the answer is generally no. And the idea of curiosity in our field is often undervalued because it feels like there isn't time. And it feels like the perspective of the educator is not always valued. We got to follow the rules and the legislation is important. And then above all, we have to understand that parents are the primary caregivers of their children, and we must do what they believe to be right for their children, which is really complicated when you have more than one. Because you're a single person with your own experiences trying to navigate an environment where there are multiple children who have multiple parents and family members that are involved in the decisions for their life that you're trying to navigate. And sometimes the environment or the culture around learning, around acceptance, around culture doesn't allow the educator to even have an opinion when they're trying to navigate everyone else's. And that also brings up a lot around retention and burnout, because it's a really important piece to doing this work and to remaining healthy. And so this well-being part really is what comes forward in a lot of this, again, where we think about if we're going to care for little ones and make sure that their mental health and their well-being is present in all that we do, then ours needs to be at a certain level to have the capacity to do so in a way that's authentic. How do you even begin those conversations when everyone's at a different level? And we're finding that culture piece really important, but also in the experience of early childhood educators. It's so diverse. What educational background do you have? Where did you come from? We are allowed to practice in Alberta with a variety of different educational backgrounds, which means that we're navigating a whole host of things, just even in foundational educational knowledge. But then if the root of that is the culture and the ethics and what you learned as a child, then how do you wrap that all up and really see everyone's uniqueness while also ensuring well-being? But also we're working with those parents to say, hey, we're here for you and we want to do the right thing by your child and realize rights and make sure that they have a voice without it seeming selfish, which I think is a really common thing, because it feels selfish to care about your own needs, especially when you're supposed to be taking care of others.
You bring up so many interesting points, and it's actually bringing us a little bit in a different direction, which I'm really excited about. We're talking a little bit more about educators, and that's so important, as you say, because it starts with the educators and how they feel about their culture, their values, and being in that space between all these differences and navigating those. And bringing up that generational piece, that our generation, and where a lot of educators have come from, they didn't grow up with that awareness or an intentional way of reflecting on culture. How do you start with educators, that process of becoming comfortable and becoming, well in their own identity and in their own self? How do you start that process?
When we think about building a system in early learning and childcare, and we have been talking about building a system since before even the Canada-wide early learning and childcare agreements, but more in the forefront now around system building is bringing together all the different pieces to successfully support children. And educator well-being and the workforce have only recently become an important part of that vision, and recognizing that without that piece, it doesn't really matter how much money you have in the system. It doesn't really matter how many spaces you have created, or if you have childcare deserts, or if you have subsidy, because if there aren't any educators to do the work, and not just do the work, but do it well, provide quality, then it doesn't exist. And so what's really interesting about that is culturally responsive practice shouldn't be new. And even though we're only just talking about this now, and the Spark Guide was only released a year and a half ago, and we're all having those like aha moments, you're right. This is a really foundational, important piece that we should have been talking about since the beginning. It's not too late. It's never too late. But we have to now think back into these structures that we already have that exist, and how do we do that thoughtfully? And again, everyone needs different amounts of time, space, materials. So I think really the most important thing to start with is conversation, making space to just have conversation. And there isn't really a way to guarantee that those in leadership positions are going to care about this or will make it a priority. But we certainly could put it into legislation that it is something that should be included in, for example, a staff handbook, or that we hope that it would be woven into HR practices, or when we think about those types of things, but there aren't even requirements for HR practice education in early childhood education. We have to be careful about what our expectations are. And then if we're asking for what sometimes feels like a whole host of extra work that requires extra time and space and materials, where we're already seeing an undervalued, underpaid, underrecognized workforce, then how do we help educators see that it's not about doing something extra, but it's actually about celebrating the whole, your uniqueness, and your experiences matter, that you matter. And in recognizing that, you'll be able to be there for children in so much more authentic of a way. The triggers will still be there, but the trauma will hopefully be something that you will have worked through in a way that feels safe for you. It's just about that exploration and finding a safe place to explore, not without expectation that this is the specific outcome. You're going to come to a place where you're going to know exactly where your values and beliefs come from. And if you don't, then you're not doing it right, or there's not a right way that you have to perform. And of course, we don't want it to be performative in nature. We want it to be authentic. But what if your values from what you learned as a child don't align with that of Canadian culture or Canadian society beliefs now? And that is a big piece around caring for children, specifically infants and toddlers, where those real thoughts around when should a child be potty trained? When should we talk about eating? Should we be talking about eating with utensils? Is that an expectation that says your child is developing appropriately or not? All those kinds of questions. And so there's so many things that come up in the day-to-day work of an early childhood educator. And of course, of the children, of questions. And so and there's no right way of answering those questions. You certainly have moments where you feel like a child reacts and you know that you made the wrong choice in that moment, but it's a learning experience and you hope for grace, again, that we're learning together. And if it's with toddlers, for example, then probably things will change in 30 seconds and it will be okay. And it might last longer if it's a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, 5-year-old going into those things. But it doesn't mean that it's not important to go back and revisit those things. Giving space for reflection and reflective practice, I think, is another really important part in this field in particular. But the reality of we're short educators in the workforce, and programs are struggling to meet all of the expectations of all the families, and then as well as the educators. And we all know inflation and everything that's happening that's made it really hard. It becomes something that's in the background. It's a nice to have instead of this should be the driving force of how you build your team. I think that's also what makes it complex, and where public policy or legislation could really be supportive in nature, and being able to have programs like the Spark Mentorship Program where somebody is just there to be a talking point or to just have casual conversation. Maybe the director doesn't feel that they can have that conversation, or educators don't feel confident that they can share how they feel because it's their fear of, I'm not going to get a raise, or I'm not going to get to stay in the classroom that I want to stay in. So the mentorship piece is really a great way to have some of those conversations, because there's a little less pressure in terms of, what does this mean? Do I have to hold back? We talk about kindness and a space for sharing, and what happens here and what happens in this conversation, what stories are shared, those stories are always yours, unless you give permission. So I think that's where the mentorship piece really does come into play, when it doesn't feel like there's space for that, to have an extra person. And we talk about that even with children. When there's a child with different needs, it's always more helpful to have another person there to be able to spend more one-on-one time, because the reality of group care is that the more one-on-one time you spend with a single child, the more you take away from everyone else. And while there is give and take, there's only so much time in the day for you to be able to do that. So I think that would be the same thing in terms of the educators and how much time you have to sit down and have those conversations, or be out of ratio to have the conversation in a way where you're not going to let go of the job duties that you have, which is to ensure the children are safe and well cared for, by having those reflective conversations, which might bring you to emotion, or they might bring you to a place of anger, or you might want to look something up or have a discussion with a family member. So it's not always possible to do that in the classroom in the midst of doing the work. So also, where do you find the time? And it's really important to be able to make the time for it.
Wow, you've brought us full circle. I loved how you walked us through, starting from legislation and policy and the system building, all the way to the nitty-gritty of whether or not you use a fork to eat, and then back through HR and how to support educators to the mentorship program, which is really where that learning can happen. So thank you so much. I just wanted to mention that the mentorship program we're talking about is done by ARC, and ARC is the Alberta Resource Center for Quality Enhancement. And the conference you mentioned just happened this November 2025. So if anyone is interested to look up the website, we can have it in the show notes later. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for that really full picture view of what it takes to support educators in that process of navigating difference and culture in the day-to-day. And I wonder if you can share some really concrete stories and examples. You mentioned a lot of the day-to-day things that come up where this happens, but do you remember a situation where either you or an educator you met and you knew incorporated that into what they do, and it wasn't an extra add-on? It was a situation where the educator was able to really reflect their own process in the work they did and how they navigated that, either with families or with kids, or maybe with their other colleagues in their team.
I think a lot of that comes up when there's a negative situation or a problem comes to be, and then you reflect on, oh, wow, we should have done that differently. And then, so how do we rebuild from there so that not necessarily it never happens again, but just so that I am more aware about that. When we are thinking about kind of that touristy perspective, which we often talk about in childcare. Okay, so we have different colored skin dolls in the room. We'll play some music from other cultures, and we'll serve different foods from the kitchen, perhaps. We'll even ask somebody for recipes, and so that it can be an authentic food for children to try from another culture. But it's still very topical in nature in terms of where does it come from. And the comments like, oh, we served chicken fried rice today, and then Johnny, who's Chinese, and oh, Johnny, you'll really like what we're going to have for lunch today. And an educator doesn't think about how that is maybe inappropriate to say that, but they think they're being accepting and recognizing that Johnny is Chinese. And so just conversations like that I think that stems from some of the triggering things for me, because I had things said like that to me growing up, but I was told that I should just be glad that people are okay with me having these two cultures, or that I should be happy that they're recognizing that I am Chinese or whatever. When I hear those conversations, it's not about saying, don't do that, but just let's have a conversation about why you felt it was necessary to say that to him. And so it usually stems from discomfort. And we talk a lot about discomfort in the FLIGHT framework as a place of growth. So that is a way that we try to find these moments and think about understanding and compassion and growth with that grace part. That the intention is not usually to be racist or negative, but just to generally deal with something that you're feeling inside. So whether that's like you felt like you needed to say something, or that you've been told we're going to be working more on culturally responsive practice, and that was the way that you thought it should be done. And it's really hard in the moment. If I were to say something to that educator in that moment, it would not have the same effect. They would just feel like I was judging them, and then they would be afraid to say things in the future potentially, or hold resentment towards me as not being accepting of them trying, and especially in front of the children, that we are saying you're not doing a good job, and then they lose trust and they question what they know, and they should be questioning it, but also giving the space for that child to, without making it seem like, oh, that really bad thing that just happened to you, let's talk about it. And then it's like a child when they swear for the first time in front of everyone, and you say, do you laugh, or do you tell them it's a really bad thing, or do you just let it go, pretend it didn't happen? And it's the same kind of thing with these cultural pieces where you wonder, should I point it out? I don't want to make them feel bad. Should I make a big deal out of this? Who am I? I'm not the same culture. So I think it's organically working through those things, and also knowing your team or your colleagues and the children to know when's the best place to have that conversation, or even just like to just mention and talk about it. A particular situation, I had a First Nations person in an educator in one of my classrooms, and it was the beginning of Truth and Reconciliation Day. when it had first come forward. And so people had been asking her questions if she had some reflections. So just it made them uncomfortable. Then it came to be like, we should maybe look into that. So it was the same. So we'd had that experience, and so they had learned, and so they wanted to play some Indigenous music in the classroom, but they didn't want it to be like a ceremonial or traditional piece that was played at a funeral or something that would be really inappropriate. So they were asking questions about that to this person, but without really acknowledging that there are many languages and many nations and many different Indigenous people that feel differently about these things, and that she doesn't speak all the languages and she doesn't know all of the cultures. And so I hadn't really noticed, but eventually it was a couple days in, and she came into my office and she said, Rebecca, I'm really happy that people care about this and that they're trying. So I don't want to make it seem like I don't want people to be asking questions. But I feel like I'm now doing everyone's planning and programming for them. And it's like they're taking the easy way out by just asking me what to do, instead of actually coming to me with a plan and then saying, like, how would this make you feel? Or is it appropriate that I could do this? And she said, or the opposite is they're just saying, can you come into our class for an hour and do something Indigenous? And she's like, I don't want to seem like I'm complaining and that I'm not glad that we're seeing change here, but it doesn't feel authentic. It feels like I'm doing a lot of work for other people who aren't really addressing this. And so it really brought forward to me, because even I was thinking like, oh, we'll just ask her. It'll be fine. And then it was like, wow, that was really ridiculous for me to think. I don't want people to just come up to me for every time they're wondering what the experience of a person who is a mixed culture person for experience. I don't know. I don't speak every language that you could ever mix with. So of course that doesn't make any sense. And so we more carefully thought about, how do we dig into this as a team? What does that look like for how we can connect and collaborate with First Nations people, in this case with this person, where we authentically care about her perspective because she has a different perspective than us, but it's not in a put her on the spot, make her feel like she has to do it for everyone because it's uncomfortable for us to dig into it. But also addressing that it's okay to feel like you're going to do it wrong and you don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. That's also a very valid reason to be thinking about it like this. So I would say that was probably one of the most eye-opening experiences for me as a director in a childcare program, around we need to rethink this. And even the person that was feeling put on the spot and uncomfortable was trying to still not make people mad by having an opinion about it. And that was just, I was really uncomfortable with us having that culture of learning in our program. And you can't just apologize. That doesn't do anything. That's what we tell children. You can't just say sorry and then do it anyways. So how do we come at this? That was a really big test for me to figure out, I feel uncomfortable about these things, and it might not be the same discomfort other people feel, but so what does that look like? And so sitting down with her and saying, what would this look like if it was ideal for you? And you felt comfortable to be who you are in this environment, and that you could stand up for yourself when you feel like your colleagues are taking advantage of you. How would you feel more comfortable, or what ways could we create space for this? So she said, I wouldn't mind having a discussion with everybody instead of me telling each individual person. Maybe in the next staff meeting, we could just have a conversation about this and on our own journey as a program towards truth and reconciliation. And so individual people can set their own goals, and then us as a team can set goals. And I thought, wow, why didn't I think about that? Anyways, so grace and kindness and trying, but also a really big learning experience, because I wanted to also figure out how could we work that into things like our personnel policies. What does this look like in terms of entrenching it into our policies, so that even if I'm not here or she's not here, or even the same team rotates, because let's be realistic, there's a lot of turnover in the field. How do we carry it forward so that we're not just proposing a very prescriptive way of doing it, but that there's space that these conversations could happen? Here are ways that you might, if you're going to have a staff meeting, could we think of it as a community of practice? And then it's a community of practice, it means there's not one person doing all the talking. It grew into a bigger and bigger thing, which I think is very much what the Spark Guide is meant to do. It's supposed to spark those conversations. And it's not a prescriptive way of doing everything, although there are actual tools that are available. it moves forward. And even just with yourself, before you start getting ready to lead others, perhaps you do the work with yourself and ask some of those questions and write some answers down, talk to your family, talk to your friends, and have that same time to reflect as well.
Thanks for sharing that story with us. I think that story would resonate with a lot of people. I think trying to do their best and things not working out, especially in the realm of culture. We don't expect people to know everything about all of these different cultures that they may encounter with their programs. And so trying to, instead of knowing everything, it's about how do you respond. And I love that you had mentioned, okay, we're going to think of this now of what could we do better next time? What do we learn from the situation? What do we carry forward? You mentioned some of the challenges of when trying to navigate these culture differences, that sometimes things show up maybe on a surface level of the fashion, food, and fun side of cultures. I was wondering if you could share any things that you have found most helpful when navigating those cultural differences that maybe go deeper into understandings of culture and also help people feel more encouraged to be in that discomfort and learn from that. Do you have any like actions people could take that you have found most helpful?
I feel like I've said it throughout, which is this conversation piece to have the discussion, but not everyone is comfortable in the same ways to have those conversations or discussions. You might not have that same relationship. It might not be part of your culture that it's appropriate for you to have that conversation with your boss, for example, or you've been maybe just pushed down for so long that you just aren't comfortable sharing who you are because for fear of persecution or for fear of judgment. And so I think it's just about trying and not ever thinking about it from a general perspective, just never assuming that every person is the same within culture or outside of culture. And then there could be similarities between people that are from different cultures, depending on how they were raised or depending on where they grew up. So I think there's also some of, not that your history and your cultural ways change inherently, but your circumstance, where you live now, what has happened, if maybe you've gone through a really difficult time together as a team, you share experiences. And within that builds also a relationship to maybe open up to other conversations. Anybody that operated a program in childcare through COVID has that trauma of what it meant for us to be like, I had an alarm on my phone to wash the walls every 2 hours. And that is just not something I ever thought I was going to have to do in this field. So having that experience to be shared with other educators in my program, but just also other educators that operated a program at that time is just something that we can go back to be like, do you remember when all your fingernails fell off because you had to wash the walls every 2 hours with really strong chemicals? And so I think finding things that you can connect with people lower the amount of stress or tension or discomfort to at least break into a conversation that could lead to a more comfortable space. And that doesn't mean, again, making any assumptions, but it's like making small talk, just trying to find something that is an opening point or a gateway that shows I'm interested in knowing more about you in the same way that I'm interested in sharing with you a little bit more about me. It's just a starting point, and finding something that you can either laugh about or reminisce or find a similarity, because ultimately the whole purpose is that we're going to work together in this kind of environment. And so if anything, we share that. So if that's what we want to talk about, then we can just start there instead of digging in much deeper to that. But with the goal of, I hope that we will dig deeper, but you have to start somewhere. So I think the whole purpose is starting, and it's really scary. And it's not going to be the same across every culture or every family. Circumstances will be different. And when you're working with a mixture of culture, a mixture of abilities, a mixture of where you live now, what the experiences that you've had, trauma, for example, then you just have to start and be willing. And sometimes it takes one person who's willing to do that, hopefully within an organization, to just be the starting point and then build from there. And then again, not that person shouldn't be the spokesperson forever for culture, but that At least it's opening for someone that was willing to or able to be in that position. And we hope for that with leaders in programs, and hopefully with the Spark Guide having some of those tools and questions and ways of approaching that gives people some ideas if you really have no idea. But the mentorship program and the other training that's offered right now is also, they're all great ways to start those conversations with yourself, which is another way to become that person, to make the first moves, hopefully. We always run into complications of your board of directors might also think we're not going to do that. So there's lots of challenges for directors where they have to have those conversations internally and externally to be able to move that work forward. I think the first steps is just to look inside yourself first, think about what something that you could share with somebody that you already feel comfortable talking about, and then build from there. And for leaders, it's about making that space and making priority, making time for it. And there's only enough hours in the day, of course, and a lot of times it's survival in this field. But if it's still top of mind, still of importance, I think it will come through. And it will be everyone at once, just like we don't expect children to develop exactly the same way all at once. But finding those little bridges where you can have little wins, little excitements, where you had a really great conversation with this person. And so perhaps you could try that, or perhaps then you now ask them, are they interested in having that conversation with someone else? Or just ways of sharing between each other, and just knowing that you're all in it for the right reasons. I think we have to remind ourselves that we all became early childhood educators for a reason, and not everybody has the same reason, but often you can find a common ground, which is for the children. Just starting with those things that are comfortable to move into the more complicated questions once you've built that relationship. And our whole work as early childhood educators is the practice of relationships, so that it shouldn't be hard. That shouldn't be the part that's hard. It's just, about being afraid of saying the wrong thing or making an assumption. And that's just learning.
Thanks, Rebecca. I really love how you've been emphasizing the importance of just starting points and getting started and trying. I wanted to highlight that we do offer introductory modules for anyone who is curious to get started in Spark but maybe doesn't know where to go. We have these interactive, self-paced modules available for free. You end up with a certificate at the end that is fully available on our website that you can check out in the show notes. You've been talking a lot about how operators and leaders can make space and make priorities for having these conversations about culture and on the ways program leaders can support their team. I was wondering if you could share some of the signs and signals you've seen that your staff are feeling more encouraged, that they are being more willing to engage with culture and have those conversations. What are some of those visible signs and signals you've seen that let you know that you're on the right path?
I think it feels a little bit presumptuous to say happiness, but when we see that with children, when we notice that they feel heard, that they're more easily able to express themselves, and we see it comes out in things like more laughter, or they want to tell you more about what they're doing because they know that there's someone that cares about how they think or how they feel. And recognizing that in a child is part of the reason why educators continue to do this work, regardless of pay or regardless of recognition or any of that, because it really truly, you see a difference. They seem lighter, they seem happier, and they express themselves more openly, and they explore concepts in a way. We see the challenges or the challenging behavior in terms of negative energy or negative ways of expressing themselves. It just goes away because they don't need to do that. They are able to do what they want and feel heard and feel unique and special just by being themselves, and they don't have to go to these extreme measures of screaming or hitting or whatever you might see in a child. And not that educators would be the same exactly that way, but when you look at a classroom setup, we hope that an educator or a day home would be the same, that part of who they are is expressed in the ways that they put provocations out for children for different things to explore. And it's not just that topical piece where you just see, oh, there's just certain pictures or we hear certain music. It's like they're bringing in their favorite music to share with the children, and it's because then they maybe encourage movement with it, or musical instruments become part of it, and they just expand on things. Like they're expanding on the children's learning, of course, with their interest in whatever it might be, but they're also bringing in their own interests into their work, into their practice. They're having that conversation with the children, and then that carries forward to confidence in having that conversation with parents, so that it also opens that pathway for the parents to share about their culture and their ways of being. And the educator is confident in sharing their ways of being so that they can find that connection piece. You start to see changes in that. And then they're not changes in that, like the whole overhaul. It's just small pieces of joy, small pockets of happiness come forward where you feel you can see a difference between someone's shoulders lowering and someone holding their head up high, and having those conversations even with parents. It's not forced, but it's actually they're excited to have a conversation, because it's not just about how many times so-and-so bit their friends today or whatever might have happened that was negative, but instead this focus on, I tried this song and then I brought in some drums and then we just tried making music, and then the children thought there's not enough drums for everyone, so why don't we make our own drums, and then we transferred into this. And you can just see these like fireworks, if you want to go with the spark image, where it just gets bigger and bigger, but in a really positive, exciting way, because there's never an end, right? There's always something you can build off of, another way to go, another conversation that can be had. And when educators start feeling more confident in terms of being heard and being allowed to express who they are, obviously there are still regulations and rules that we have to follow, but within that they have more freedoms. It becomes very obvious in just the way that the team works together, in the way that the classroom looks. All the classrooms look different because they reflect who's in them, including the educators. And that's where I think you really can start to see these environments versus just spaces with children in them, but they're spaces for children, for the children in them specifically that live in those spaces. And same for educators.
Thank you so much for sharing those tangible signs and signals that you're on the right path. I love that you would have highlighted happiness as one of them, I think, and seeing the positive impact when staff feel that they can bring themselves to the workplace and how that inspires and ripples through the whole center. I think that's such a encouraging sign for people to look forward to. To wrap up this episode, maybe I want to highlight one takeaway from this conversation. I really like how you had started with thinking structurally and how to create that welcoming environment, and thinking even on a systems level in more structural ways that we structure teams. How can that all support this goal of being more welcoming? So that was something that really resonated with me. What about you, Taya?
Yeah, I would echo that, Sarah. These elements stood out for me as well. I love that you gave us the whole picture, from the system to the nitty-gritty and the everyday. And the way you spoke about it really takes the pressure off the educator. It is not all on the educator to figure this out and to be good at this. And
there needs to be this whole support system around educators so they can be comfortable in their own self and bring that into the work.
because, as you say, there is so much burnout and there's so much turnover in the workforce, and it needs to be really a priority to make sure that the educators are well supported.
Thank you so much for asking such thought-provoking questions. And I think if there was one thing that I would hope for educators or leaders listening to this to take away would be that it's challenging, but it is so worthwhile to do the work for yourself and within yourself, as well as alongside your team. And then we can more authentically do that and be there for the children and their families. And that admitting that it is hard is the truth. And that's okay, because a lot of the work that we have to do as early childhood educators is hard. Not everything is going to feel right, but hopefully some things feel right. And it's just finding that one starting point to move forward on, whether that's within yourself first, and then slowly from person to person in those practice of relationships, and that it is possible, even within all of the challenges that we see within our field, to find time to make it important in our journey. So thank you for having me.
Thank you again, Rebecca. It's been really a great conversation. And thank you again for joining us. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes for any links or resources that were mentioned in today's episode. And if you want to learn more about culturally responsive childcare, go to sparkguide.ca to download the Spark Guide, access free trainings, and find more resources. See you in the next episode.